that's there to support them, to give them those insights that they need as well. And I think it is working collaboratively to kind of build the knowledge and a story about what's happening with the inventory.
Thanks. And Izabela, I'm particularly intrigued by your job title as a senior AdOps analyst. You do these things in practice. You really look into kind of the world of programmatic. What kind of insights do you find that are relevant for publishers?
I think that when we talk about data, that publishers mostly, when we work with, and they mostly focus on data like impression, revenue, CMP, and from my point of view, when they more developed, they can try to use more data like win rate, bid rate to help them increase their knowledge about how the programmatic environment looks like for the inventory. With this data, they can choose how the programmatic strategy will look like. For example, looking at win rate, our publishers very usually want to looking at low win rate, they try to remove SSPs which are not effective for them. So it's usually depends on the publisher. When we have very basic publishers, they don't need some complex data from SSPs, from reporting. But when we have more advanced publishers, they need a lot more sophisticated reporting.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned some of the strategies, Jackie and Izabela, that publishers can use. Now, as I mentioned in my introduction, on the buy side, we've seen SPO being all the rage. So optimization, taking control of the supply chain, trying to either shorten it, to optimize it, to use it more strategically. And have seen publishers opening up to programmatic because they became more skilled. There wasn't this fear anymore that the demand side powers acting like an avalanche and kind of suppressing their margins. Now, with SPO getting traction, what can publishers do? We got the acronym DPO, demand path or demand preference optimization. What can they do to optimize the demand, to pick what are good advertisers for me, what aren't good advertisers? How do I orchestrate my SSPs maybe in a more dynamic way? Shane, what are you seeing from an IPONWEB perspective here?
Yeah, so I think DPO is one of those things that it's become a necessary evil, as it were. But I think you can undertake it on two levels, both tactical and strategic. So, tactically, you just need to understand who are the good buyers, sort of what are the payment terms that you're being extended by the different buyers, and that may depend on the platform that's being used. So, you can also look at things like win rates, clearing prices, and so on to understand, who's actually keenly interested in buying your inventory, and then try to understand also what's the ad quality like associated with those buyers. On a more strategic level, then, I think recent initiatives or additions, I guess, to the open RTB standards, like, for example, the content object. One of the previous panels spoke about the rise of CTV, and probably most growth coming from that area in the next few quarters. I think the content object, is a hugely important mechanism for CTV publishers to try and understand, what's the nature of interest in my inventory. So I think it has something like up to 40 different parameters that can be populated by the SSP on the way to various demand partners. So things around, the name of the show, for example, the ratings that a show has, a whole range of useful information that a buyer can look at to determine whether a desired audience actually exists within that inventory pool. And so really, working, I think SSPs have a responsibility in that context to really work with their publishers to understand, firstly, can you pass this information? And publishers should be asking the question, can you support me passing this information to DSPs. And then if you can mine that in a way that's clever, you know, there's a whole host of useful insight and intelligence that can be gleaned from it.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, in our prep call, you mentioned the term demand path mapping. I'm pretty curious what's behind that. Can you enlighten us?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the big challenges around demand path optimization is just simply understanding who is actually delivering, and this is the key word in my mind, incremental value, right? As Shane kind of touched on there, it's not just, okay, let's, you know, plug in a bunch of partners and we'll hope that they kind of shake out to the best overall revenue. But really trying to understand where is that demand coming from, and constructing that mapping, I think, is really one of the key first steps in a demand path optimization strategy, right? Is saying, okay, what SSPs do we have laid out? Those SSPs plug into what DSPs, those DSPs access what agencies and brands. Constructing that mapping gives you that kind of insight into where your value is actually coming from. And then layering on, I think, a more holistic view of the partner. As Shane outlined, you know, some of the questions around your payment terms, questions around the latency that they may introduce if you have them in a client-side header bidding integration versus if you have them server to server, if you have them just existing as a buyer through some other partner. Creating that mapping, I think, is a great way to kind of lay out what currently exists as the structure. And going back to your kind of first point, there's been an explosion in partner diversification, right? It used to be everyone kind of works with 2-3 partners. All of a sudden you're working with, you know, 10 to 12. I think naturally there's kind of a thinning that is happening for most publishers right now as they kind of optimize and say, well, maybe we don't need all these partners. That's a huge process, and undertaking who's delivering that value in which way, and creating that structure is a great first step. Also, I would be remiss here, and I promised the IAB Europe that I would mention, we did actually put together a little bit of a guide for DPO. It was released back in September. It answers some of these questions, some of the, I think, initial kind of first steps, and lays out some of the concepts around how to construct this mapping and how to kind of, you know, fulfill some of the promises of DPO.
Let's take a brief step back and try to synthesize some of your answers from all of you here. I think a key takeaway that we can already see is we've got new terms and new complexities, but it shouldn't be daunting for publishers. So some things are kind of one-off exercises, you know, payment terms, for instance, or a demand path mapping. You know, that's something that can probably be done in a static manner. Other things are more kind of in the AdOps world, which need to be always on. Block lists were mentioned, and other analytic tools. So there's a whole portfolio available. I think in the remaining minutes, I wouldn't go to the heart of the issue, which is, again, many different SSPs or general partners on the publisher side, often understaffed teams at publishers, and different taxonomies of data. If you look at the reporting interfaces or even SSP APIs, what's an advertiser, what's a brand, kind of what's in the buyer field, how much information does the interface give you, different visuals, different kind of time periods. There's a high degree of fragmentation. Yes, we have in other areas of the industry, standardization, we got like pre-bid, great. We got as.txt, great. Supply chain.object, great. But when it comes to the actual reporting and making sense of things, I think there's a real risk of balkanization here. So a question to all of you before we already have to wrap up. How can the intermediaries kind of work together in such a sense that they can empower their publishers to see the data kind of holistically, you know, like a true north? We've seen it on the buy side with Datorama, Beacon, and other integration platforms that synthesize things. What can publishers do to bring all this together? And how can you guys actually, or how are you collaborating to make it easier for publishers to compare apples and apples? Who wants to start?
I'll go. Yeah, I think one of the sessions before touched on, you know, the PwC is the study. There's already a task force at hand, kind of looking into that. Where did that 15% go? But I think a big part of what that task force is trying to do is bring us all together now and actually standardize the language around, you know, these parameters that we talk about, because, you know, one SSP will do it differently to another SSP. And I think this is where all of the confusion lies, especially for publishers when they have to invest in analysts to kind of look at this data and to ensure that, you know, there's not misinterpretation of the data too. So I think the I think there needs to be a lot more of that. There needs to be a standard. There needs to be a standard language. It's not going to be simple. I think that's where the industry will try and get to. But having that standardized language, I think, in terms of, you know, what does the data mean, I think will really help the industry as a whole.
Yeah, I can agree with Jacqueline. Working with a different SSP, I see that there is problem, like even for us analysts, when we see very different metrics for the same, very different same metric but different naming for in dashboards in SSPs. So it can be quite difficult to understand what we are looking for, what we want to know, what we want, what numbers we want to see. So I think it's standardized. These metrics is a clue for publishers and for us as companies.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I'm getting a timeout signs here. So very quickly, Mark and Shane, if you got a 20-second recommendation.
Sure, I'll go. So I think it's a really good question, and it sounds like a sensible question, Daniel, but I'm not sure there's a satisfactory answer. I think because of what's happening with the deprecation of persistent IDs, the single source of truth kind of era is for now at least a bygone era. I think maybe we'll get to a point where, you know, we have common standards around analytics specifically over time. But for right now, I think for the sort of the year or two at least, publishers, you know, their version of truth is really, you know, it relates to the tool set that they use, and that may depend on whether you're, you know, heavily reliant on exposing audiences via persistent IDs. So your version of truth may be identity resolution provider X via pre-bid because you know, your agency of choice uses the same vendor in their DSP of choice. For another publisher, it could be contextual signal. And therefore, you know, your contextual vendor is important, but I think it's going to just simply take time, unfortunately, to get back to common standards.
And just to kind of wrap up here, having built actually a taxonomy and labeling normalization technology, we know firsthand how difficult that is, how complicated it is. My advice would be to leverage partners. You know, again, going back to kind of the concept that we are the marketplace, we are the owners of programmatic. We all have that innate ability. So my advice would be to speak with every possible, you know, SSP that you're thinking about working with, DSPs, get the normalizations from them, look at different technologies that are available out there that do this already, and really be, you know, not just consultative, I think, but input your own knowledge into that space as well. That is the strongest thing that I think publishers can do, is to represent themselves.
Thank you all for your insights, for sharing this. Fascinating discussion. I could have continued for a long time. I'm going to pass back to the studio. Thank you all for joining. Back to David.
Thank you, Dan, and all panelists. It was clearly a topic of interest in the industry. So sharing your experience here would have been greatly appreciated by many. Before we move on to the final panel of the day, we just want to get your feedback to see whether you agree that SSPs should standardize taxonomies and data to help publishers in the open internet. So please let us know by taking part in our final poll. And hopefully the results will be in. I'd like to say, you know, the Programmatic Trading Committee will be continuing their effort and this conversation in our work plan. And as Mark Bausinger said as well, with regards to not just SPO, but DPO advice, please go to the IAB Europe's website. And the results should be in a second. And while we wait for them, maybe we'll, there you go. Yes, very much answer if SSP should standardize taxonomies. Now on to our final panel of the day, which I'm so pleased to see on the agenda, delivering powerful creatives within programmatic advertising. So we may have the smartest targeting and measurement capabilities in the world, but if at the last hurdle, the creative does not resonate with the consumer, it's all wasted. And this is why creativity has to be a key part of any discussion in programmatic advertising. I'm therefore delighted to introduce Lisa from PubMatic, who will lead the panel discussion on how technology and data delivered programmatically can help power creatives that resonate with audiences. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, David. And thank you to everyone for joining. But I wanted to hand this over to the actual panel, who are experts in this. So we'll give them a chance to introduce themselves and I think answer the first question of how does creative differ in a programmatic environment? So I'll go alongside of my screen. So Johnny, over to you.
There's the unmute button. Yeah, the biggest difference with dynamic creative, right, is that there are often these triggers that allow kind of a customized and tailored experience to happen. And a lot of programmatic is fully functioning with a lot of automation that's happening already. But the creative element really kind of comes to life with this dynamic creative element. I think the distinguishing element now is a little bit blurred because HTML5 can do so much more than what has traditionally been done in the past, but it's also kind of an exciting new frontier because it seems like we're just kind of getting started with some of these advanced automation tools that are just kind of like warming up.
Thanks, Johnny. Over to Cecile.
Hi, Lisa, and thanks for having me. I honestly do not have anything to add upon what Johnny just explained. So, yeah.
Okay, over to Benjamin.
Hi, I'm Benjamin. I'm in charge of the strategy at Triton. So I think actually Johnny did a pretty thorough explanation of what is the topic of the session today. So I have not much to add there.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks. And Johnny, thanks for that description. I'll let Kelly introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Kelly from Microsoft. I'm a director of partnerships. Again, I think Johnny did a great job. I think the only thing I'd add is with all those triggers and all that kind of optionality with dynamic creative comes a ton of data and a ton of things you can analyze on. And so that adds to the overall complexity, I think, of what could be with programmatic. And so I think like that'll be a topic that we're gonna talk about a little bit more here, is just that complexity that comes with the territory.
Thanks, Kelly. And over to Anne.
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Anne. I'm the automation lead for Spotify in EMEA. Thanks for having me. Again, yeah, I agree with everything that has been said. I'm looking forward to this panel and discussing the intricacies of creativity, programmatic, data, and context.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. And so I think the next question is really more about the best practices of it and what it really, I think we covered off kind of what it really is. So I will give it to Kelly to start to talk about best practices.
Sure. I mean, for us, it really kind of comes down to thinking through, like I was saying a minute ago, you have so many tools in your belt around what you can do with programmatic. So like Johnny was talking about the triggers, you can do a variety of things around both how you buy and also, you know, how you target and the type of experience it renders to the consumer. So I think for us, it really is about going back towards remembering that the programmatic doesn't really kind of relieve you of the responsibility of having that creativity and really being able to have a strong message you're trying to connect with the consumer, with the brand, and focus really on having the consumer delighted by that experience, using and augmenting that with the tools you have through programmatic, but not really over relying on kind of having too many of those things pulled in.
And you look like you're going to say something. So
no,
I'll
I was just going to add to that. I agree. I think like kind of creative or creativity as a whole doesn't really differ based on the delivery channel that you're looking at, and that a good creative ID is a good creative ID, whether it's delivered through kind of direct or programmatic pipes. The one thing I would add though, and kind of in line with what Kelly touched on, is that I think programmatic is really an enhancer of creativity because it allows a creative ID to really get developed by bringing in data, precision, efficiency, all the benefits of programmatic, and to really enhance and get it to the next level. So I would say that they're complementary together.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, I think so. Triton is really specialized in the audio space. So one thing we've seen with the growth of online audio is at first it was radio spot used on music service or podcast, which is not a good experience. So if you think about the good user experience and you put programmatic in it, and you also think about programmatic creative, then you can make sure that the ad is fused in the content. You don't put something with super noisy ad when you listen to a podcast that has a different type of context, or if you listen to jazz music. So you could, with programmatic creative, make sure that the ad correctly fit the ambience of the content you want to stitch the ad into. So I think that's really important, and that's also help. It's not just to better target in a sense of targeting just based on user data, but also targeting or making sure that the context is also taken into account, so people don't feel that you're forcing an ad the wrong way, and then it creates a negative impact on the brand because it's kind of parachute inside an environment where people would say, what the heck is that thing that just like disrupted what I'm doing? So I think this is where programmatic creative, so I've given the example with audio, but it's the same with other channels, to just make sure it fits, it blends with the main piece of content, because people are not going on the internet to say, I want to see ad. They want to do something, and then there's ad that supports what they want to do. So you need to make sure the ads will be correctly integrated in the end user experience.
Definitely. Okay, so over to the next question. I think that, Kelly, you mentioned the user experience, but what is the role of technology? So Johnny, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I mean, I think the technology example about programmatic going into dynamic creative is really exciting, because we traditionally think about it as just display, but seeing our audio colleagues from Triton and from Spotify is really exciting, because it's actually a fundamental, just like strategic concept where you can drop in and then you're tailoring it for that message. So the technology itself is going to evolve. Podcasting wasn't even a thing when dynamic creative was started with Flash and all the stuff in a bygone era. So right now we're kind of at this moment where HTML5 is the way, programmatic, pre-bid, all this stuff is making it go faster and more relevancy, even with all these privacy things happening. So the technology itself, I think, is going to evolve. It kind of doesn't matter. There's some stuff that's making it easier, but conceptually what's happening is that we're fully on programmatic. We're fully on with kind of this dynamic insertion. And then forgive me for the pun on this, but the creativity of like how you put it in to make more relevancy with all of the triggers that are traditionally used for like day parting, weather, and so on, is just making more relevancy with more kind of opportunities to be better in front of potential users and customers.
Thanks, Johnny. Anne, do you have a comment on this as well?
Yeah, no, I do. I agree with what Johnny said, obviously. I think, yeah, to me, when it comes to creativity, technology has two main roles, really. I think it's in the very first panel that Nicolas from Xaxis touched on it. But essentially, I think technology is really allowing us, through programmatic, to add layers to creativity. So that means that, and audio is a perfect example for it, because it means that you would have your core ID, which is a great creative ID, and then you can start really playing around with it and adding some depth to your strategy by looking at context, at audience targeting, at moments, at sequential targeting, all the things you can do through programmatic pipe. And that's why I'm thinking of technology really as a layer and multiple layers on top of the creative ID. And I think the other role of technology in that space is on the measurement and the learning side of things, because through programmatic, you get obviously data in real time about the performances, and you can really iterate much quicker on your creative ideas and the strategies you're developing around them. And that's a core role of technology when it comes to creativity, in my opinion.
I really agree, sorry to jump in there, but really agree with what Anne just said about the iterative nature of creative optimization that is enabled by programmatic. And one campaign that we were really proud of happened recently with the Axis in Norway was for Volvo. And what happened is that they really collaborated with Mindshare, the ID, also Grave was for the creative side, and with the client, of course, and of course, the Axis for activation. And what they did was to create that culture of continuous innovation by really iterating and testing different things. So changing the logo, changing the layout, so really talking together with the creative aspect and the more media buying aspect. And then from there, really iterating, testing different things, different messages for different audiences. And it was really successful, like really enabled by that collaboration. And then on top of that, the technology was then an enabler of that collaboration. So we plugged in our AI platform, Copilot, to help with the optimization and with the audience targeting component. And the result was amazing. So the number of conversions was quadrupled. But in all that, what really was at the heart of the success was the collaboration, and then the tech was layered to cater to use cases to allow for that iteration, testing different things, and just continuously improving.
Thanks, Cecile. So I'm just going to move on to the next question in effort of time. But so I think that the fusion of data and creativity is fairly a new discipline. Who would you guys say is responsible for maximizing the creative impact of that media buy? And Anne, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, yeah. I think on this one, success is really a factor on how closely the buyer and the media owner can work together on actually both the creative ID and the delivery of the ID. For instance, if I take like Spotify as an example, we have a creative solution team that works with the client ahead of the campaign on the creative ID, on the concept, potentially on the production, depending on what's needed. And then we also have a unique set of first-party data and insights about our users' behavior on the platform that we share with our partner to help with planning and make sure that the ad is served at the right moment in the best context possible to optimize the impact. So to me, it's really that like working relationship on both the creativity and the strategy and targeting through programmatic that is the source of success. And that's how we maximize the ad performance and also the user experience, which was just mentioned before by one of my co-panelists in the approach.
Thanks, Anne. And over to Kelly.
Yeah, I agree with everything Anne said. I think the only thing I'd add is, looking kind of forward as we're thinking about how we measure consumer engagement and working closely with all that data that you have to analyze around how you can really measure that consumer engagement. We're thinking around what kind of new KPIs and what are new things we can do to show that effectiveness when we add in that data and add in all those other layers. So, for example, we just joined the Attention Council on the Microsoft side, and that's really a group that's trying to focus more on things that you can look at beyond kind of short-term performance-based KPIs. I think programmatic sort of gets put in that box of just trying to measure clicks and that sort of thing. And so really what we're trying to do is think around what are longer-term brand building metrics that can really start to use this tech to show the user having many touch points through the consumer decision journey and ultimately leading to an outcome that's more effective for our brand. And I think that there's a lot of room here still to grow, to be using the tech and the data and thinking more beyond just getting clicks or getting impressions or views, and how you really use the tech a little bit more effectively to think longer term.
Thanks, Anne. Benjamin, did you want to add something?
So on that question, I think it's a collaboration, because what we see, especially in going back to audio, it's even though it has grown tremendously in the past few years, it's not necessarily all agencies or DSPs that have ready available audio creative, especially if you want to do dynamic creative. So you need to make sure you work that everyone is willing to roll the sleeves and work a bit harder, and I think it'll be successful. So the buying agency may need to loop in the creative agency or the brand directly, or work, as what Anne said, like with some publishers. The publishers like Spotify or radio stations will have specialists, and they can potentially create the creative. So it requires maybe a bit more work than if you run just a display campaign, but I think it's worthwhile. So it has to be collaboration. Programmatic help achieve things you couldn't do manually. Like, let's say you want to you represent a quick service restaurant and you want to change the creative for the morning and the lunchtime, and you want to do it on a per postal code basis. That would be impossible to do this without programmatic, because you would need to send a load of emails with a lot of creatives and hoping that the best that people knows what traffic where. So the technology helped that, but you still need to have the creative. This is where you just need to have a plan and work jointly with the two types of agencies, creative and buying, as well as the publisher.
Okay, thanks. And I just to follow off of that, I think, is there actually a difference between dynamic creative optimization and creative management platforms? As we know, both create opportunities to maximize the impact of revenue within programmatic and direct advertising.
I mean, there is a difference, because the way the CPM gets charged means that there's an opportunity to be a lot more efficient by effectively utilizing each of those platforms for what they're built for. The DCO kind of optimization platforms that are a little bit fancier, you know, they have higher CPMs. They're used for something that's a little bit down the funnel typically, right? Because there's a lot more money there. When you're thinking about what HTML5 can do now, which is basically anything, you can do kind of the right creative flighting and have a much more cost-effective strategy at play. You gotta, I think about this holistically, but it's a great opportunity because with the way the CPMs are on programmatic, where anywhere between like $1 to $4, right? It's a huge difference, because if you're having an expensive CPM to just flight to the DCO, your kind of math can change really dramatically very quickly.
Thanks, Johnny. Anyone else want to comment on this, or should we move on to the next question?
I think I agree with what, go ahead, Anne. Okay. No, because to go back to your question, the difference between those two types of platform is also like going back to the use case, because creative management is more about perhaps tailored up production, and dynamic creative management is more tailored towards decisioning and automation of that decisioning. So being able to absorb feeds and then assemble assets on the fly. But at the end of the day, there will be a whole lot of spectrum of different types of companies that may offer one or both, one or the other of both. And what counts is that you have the right people to be able to pick for select use cases, the right, which is why we have actually created a unit at Xaxis this year called Xaxis Creative Studios, to have designers and developers and people who can be more creative centric, still having that data expertise, but bringing more that culture active and being able to select the right tools depending on the use case.
Thanks, Cecile. Anne?
Yeah, and I fully agree with that. I think that also kind of sometimes a programmatic creative doesn't necessarily need to be actually dynamic or even reliant on kind of too much additional tech to be great. And in particular in the audio space, like that's kind of the beauty and simplicity of audio, where the production costs are much lower, and we kind of touch on that as well. But just making a smart use of data to inform the programmatic delivery strategies and leveraging all the targeting options that we have access to through programmatic pipes can make just a simple creative really brilliant without too much tech or additional cost.
Thanks so much. So moving on to the next question, as we've talked about creative, how well does programmatic creative work for brand and direct advertising and creative optimization and creativity? Kelly, I'll let you start.
Yeah, I mean, for Microsoft, it's worked really well. We find it a very effective channel. We've got a variety of programmatic campaigns that we're running across display, video, connected TV, native formats. You know, we've got also, as you can imagine, a really large consumer graph and sort of data footprint around first-party data. So we've got, you know, a lot of stuff that we get through our search activity or web activity on our properties, LinkedIn data or demographic data. So our corporate marketing team, you know, has tested using a lot of that across the programmatic channel and layering that data on there, and you know, they've found fantastic results. So they've been continuing to optimize and grow that channel. Also, you know, Microsoft has been focusing on leveraging programmatic and data to help other advertisers achieve their campaign outcomes as well programmatically. We have the Microsoft Audience Network, which really is a platform that we've developed that helps advertisers leverage that Microsoft first-party data and add that to their own data, and then be able to, you know, extend their campaigns across MSN or Outlook or Microsoft Edge or other properties that we have. And so we're seeing, you know, really strong results and great outcomes there through the flexibility of that channel. I think really, like, you know, as there's going to kind of think like Johnny was saying, is there's going to be more stricter privacy and regulatory laws, and you know, changes in how browsers handle third-party cookies and all that kind of stuff. It's going to put an enormous amount of pressure on that third-party data, and I think that emphasizes even more the value that, you know, brands are going to find in first-party data and in publisher first-party data and contextual targeting and all sorts of things like that, which will become kind of pillars, I think, of how we buy programmatically in the future.
Thanks, Kelly. Benjamin, did you want to add from an audio perspective?
Yeah, I think there's it works both for upper and lower funnel strategy. I suppose it depends how you use the technology. So for the lower funnel, the example I gave for the quick service restaurant, you may want to have a really specific offer depending on the postal code and time of day. So that would be a good example of trying to do drive conversion, last mile conversion, let's say. But if you go back to my first comments at the beginning, if you know you want to do branding and awareness, but you want to buy across podcast, music service, radio, as I said, you don't want to use the same creative because it may not be a good fit, and you don't want to project your brands, put your brand on the wrong foot the first time a listener listens to your brand. So you may want to have the right music bed, the right message. So then you could use also dynamic creative to just pick and choose the right creative, knowing where it will play. Or the time of the day, but more just for brand awareness. There's a cost involved, like Kelly said. So Johnny said, sorry. So there's you need to pick and choose the right tactic, but I think it's useful on a two strategy.
Can I just add, sorry, in terms of that brand versus direct, that in terms of user experience, it doesn't really make sense, because I know that we talked quite a bit about really at the end of the day, improving the creative is improving the user experience. And we know that it's important because it's at the heart of that tacit agreement between users and publishers that the content is made available for free because we're serving ads. And so if we think in terms of user experience, that brand versus direct doesn't really make sense. So for example, in the Volvo campaign that I mentioned before, they did several tests, for example, with interactive elements, like do we add them and at which stage of the funnel? And what they realized was that the place where it was working best was actually mid-funnel, when a user had already been to the website. And when you think about it, it does make sense, because you don't want to try and see how to customize the car if you haven't even really been exposed to the overall brand narrative. And so in that user experience lens, it does make sense. And it means that, yeah, maybe for some of those use cases, technically it will be a brand budget, but from a user experience, there's actually a whole funnel that you can work through. And the best way to approach it is just to test different things and see what works.
Thanks, Cecile. Just conscious of time, I think that if we could all look into our crystal balls, what would you say is the future of programmatic creativity? Cecile, I'm going to start with you.
Well, user experience centric. So making ads work better for people, which will be just at the heart of the ecosystem. Making creatives work harder to reach the outcomes that our clients desire. So tailoring those creatives more towards actual outcomes than clicks, which actually may be a misleading metric sometimes. But also thinking that programmatic plus creative can mean DCO, yeah, but not just that. So we're starting to see lots of digital native formats arrive, like we have conversational ads, which is a format with IAB standards, but actually you can interact with the brand, rich media, contextually relevant creative, where the creative picks up contextual signal to make the ad relevant, is going to be probably the future of programmatic, and all of that enabled by more collaboration, because that creative and media split doesn't really make sense when it comes to building the best user experience.
Thanks, Cecile. Benjamin, over to you.
So in the audio space, all of the technology is there. I think the adoption is not yet where it should be, but we're seeing a steady growth and usage of the programmatic creativity capabilities. So I'm hopeful that in 2021, a lot of the campaigns at the end of the year would leverage to some extent some programmatic creativity capabilities.
Thanks, Benjamin. Over to Anne.
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple of things. One, to piggyback on what Cecile just said, is the idea of thinking of programmatic plus creativity in a broader way. And interestingly, we're seeing an increasing number of our clients working with us on really custom projects like digital experiences, for instance, delivered by our creative solution team, with a media plan driving traffic exclusively through programmatic, so that they kind of get the best of both worlds, like the creative expertise and the science of media buying for performances. So that would be my first point. And I think the second point is, when it comes to programmatic and creativity, is to see brands and media agencies and media owners increasingly working closer together before the campaign, so that we can share our unique insights and all of the data that we have about our users to inform both the creative idea and the strategy during the campaign to optimize, and also after the campaign, back to the idea of learning cycle and iterating on ideas and getting better at the next one. So those would be my two main points for the future.
Thanks, Anne. Kelly?
I agree with everything everyone said so far. So trying to think of things that weren't already listed. I think for us, when we're looking forward, I think really rethinking too around what kind of KPIs and metrics we have, and looking for that greater engagement, and how that is more than just sort of impressions or clicks, and how it really translates through the entire consumer journey, and having the tech that allows you to do that. And then native for us is a really growing channel, and we're seeing really good engagement across that. And so we'll continue to push on the native programmatic front.
And Johnny, I will end with you.
The things that we're doing now at MediaCom that's really exciting, I think, is a really good slice of the future. One thing that we've done is set up a vision analytics. So it uses machine learning and then artificial intelligence to see what's inside of an ad. And this is across English, across dozens of languages globally. And you can actually synthesize and quantify all of the different elements in the ad and heat map them, and then have a visual kind of score of all of the different elements. So as you are moving them around dynamically from a logo on the left side to a logo on the right side, you can model and know exactly how that changes. So we're getting to an atomic level about what the elements are, the colors, the precision. So all of this data is going to allow for better advertising. We're going to have better customer moments in the customer journey. And this is, I think, kind of a really exciting part of the future, because this isn't requiring lots of new technology. It's a natural part of the workflow, and it's integrated now with something that we're starting with. So we've already kind of, I think, begun.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining this panel and sharing your expertise. I'm going to hand this over back to David.
Much, Lisa, and to all the panelists. And thank you very much for sharing what the future could look like. Well, we're almost at the end of the 2020 H2 Virtual Programmatic Day, and a little over time, but what an event it has been. We've had over 500 tuning in to this event, which is really incredible. I want to thank all our sponsors for today's event, MoPub and OneTrust Preference Choice. We would not be able to put on these events without your valuable support, so thank you. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists and moderators for giving up their time, sharing their knowledge and views on the important topics that we discussed and debated today. I'm sure many of our attendees will have taken an idea or more away with them, which will be used to improve their own business. I'd like to thank Helen Massard and Lauren Wakefield from IAB Europe on pulling together and delivering another successful Virtual Programmatic Day. And finally, thank you to all of you, the attendees, for tuning in. Without your support and interest, we wouldn't have a Virtual Programmatic Day. It should take a couple of minutes to provide your feedback in our short event survey at the end of this session. Will be very much appreciated. And again, the event recording, as always, will be available on IAB Europe's website over the next few days. Also, a lot of other great resources on the website related to programmatic, from white papers, guides, 101 videos. So check it out, the Knowledge Hub on the IAB Europe. And the next VBD will be taking place in April next year. So keep an eye out for more information. As mentioned at the beginning of the event, all of our speakers from IAB Europe member companies. Find out more about them, please contact Charlie or Helen. Details are on screen. And finally, IAB Europe has a huge range of other upcoming events, webinars, including some great industry insider webinars with Spotify and Magnite. Join Spotify and L'Oreal at 11 a.m. CT tomorrow for live, the future of programmatic streaming, and Magnite 4 p.m. CT on the 1st of December for a CTV research preview and a look into the future of this channel. All details are on IAB Europe's website under events. For all upcoming events, please make sure you tune in and connect with us. We're just going to put up on screen the results, if we have them, of the first poll in the first panel, which we didn't predict. So look at that, CTV. So please do tune into that session being run by Magnite, because we all think CTV is the biggest growth area in programmatic in 2021. And thank you all one last time, and stay safe.